Climate change is a global crisis threatening our entire world. However, some are suffering much worse than others. Climate change has created deep inequalities and injustices between the rich and the poor, from responsibility, impacts, the capacity to cope, and even climate agreements. The poorer developing countries are suffering disproportionately more, with small island states having their existence threatened by the impact of climate change, even though they are less responsible for its causes. It is important to look at global policies that address how to prevent the climate crisis from deteriorating. It is also necessary to discuss policies that are aimed specifically at stopping the injustices and inequalities climate change has caused. We propose 3 policies aimed to mitigate the climate crisis. The first is a new focus on sustainable development and fairer negotiations. The second is a new cap and trade system. And the third is a focus on global governance. As discussed, wealthier developed countries are responsible for the bulk of greenhouse gas emissions that have contributed to climate change, with the US responsible for 25% of historical greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, in regards to climate policy, it is vital that these countries take on the most responsibility for dealing with the impacts, even if these impacts are not yet affecting them. However, if ambitious climate goals are going to be reached, such as the 2015 Paris Agreement, which calls for a 2-degree limit on rising global temperatures, developing countries still need to implement climate policies. This is because as they steadily develop, in the same way developed countries once did, they will begin to increase their production of greenhouse gases. However, holding developing countries to the same standards as developed ones is hardly fair, considering historically, when developed countries were industrializing, they did so without any restrictions on their greenhouse gas emissions, which then subsequently created the current climate crisis. On top of this, climate policies and the technologies and infrastructures needed to fulfill them are expensive, and something that developing countries who struggle with issues such as extreme poverty are unable to prioritize or afford. Therefore, a key policy for tackling climate injustice is climate finance. One form of this is climate finance for sustainable development. Developed, wealthier countries should be obliged to fund sustainable development in developing countries. This can be done by funding low-carbon technologies that reduce emissions while also facilitating economic growth. The Green Climate Fund, established by the UNFCCC, is an example of this and is the driver of global climate finance. As of February 2020, $10.3 billion has been pledged towards the Green Climate Fund, who will utilize these funds to aid developing countries. This money can be spent on sustainable development as well as mitigation and adaptation initiatives that help countries deal with the impacts of climate change they are facing. Some of their projects include helping reverse the degradation of coral reefs in the Caribbean and also helping to adopt agricultural practices to become more resilient in hotter climates. It is also argued that climate finance should come in the form of compensations for countries like those in Africa who depend on oil and gas, as these account for 70% of African exports and make up half of Africa's GDP. However, these concerns are often not acknowledged in climate agreements and negotiations, and in the 2015 Paris Agreement there was no mention of Africa's economic vulnerabilities. As with the case of the Caribbean island states lobbying for the Paris Agreements to make 2 degrees the set limit, many concerns from groups of developing countries are being dismissed in climate negotiations. Therefore, within climate negotiations, there need to be structures and policies that give developing countries more power in decisions and also prevent corruption and coercion. The UNFCCC needs to make collective efforts to ensure all concerns are heard and acknowledged, and ensure there are not unequal power relations within discussions. Another climate policy that could help tackle climate change is the global cap and trade system. The system works by placing a cap on industry's emissions, and if they remain under this cap, they can sell and trade their emission credits to others. This provides financial incentives to reduce carbon emissions. Over time, the cap will lower, meaning companies will have to implement sustainable production methods. This has been implemented in the EU, which has used this policy to reduce energy-intensive industries by 43% in the past 16 years. If this were to be applied globally, the caps on emissions could vary depending on historical contributions to global emissions, focusing on equity rather than equality. It also gives responsibility to the individual companies rather than the country as a whole. In theory, climate policies and initiatives such as climate finance will help to tackle the injustices and inequalities caused by climate change and the high emissions produced by developed countries. However, it is difficult to hold countries accountable to the promises and pledges, and therefore many policies are not being realized to their full potential. As seen in the Paris Agreement, countries set their own emission targets and there are no enforcement mechanisms in place. Changing political power can cause disruptions to the agreement, such as when Donald Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement. Therefore, there needs to be stronger enforcement of these targets and commitments. One idea, proposed by economist William Nordhaus, is the idea of creating a climate club as model for international climate policy. This would create sanctions against those who do not participate in climate policies. These sanctions could come from not receiving the benefits of being part of the climate club and can include trade penalties for non-members. This mechanism, or one similar, could be used as a way of indirectly exerting global governance without a loss of sovereignty. Developed countries that do not fulfill promises on climate goals and climate finance can be economically penalized through trade restrictions. There should also be increased and enhanced monitoring of progress within countries. Progress indicators should be utilized to monitor if a country is fulfilling their targets and achieving their goals. At the heart of tackling climate injustice are policies that hold developed, wealthier countries accountable for their past and present emissions that have created the current climate crisis. This can be achieved by climate finance, where developed countries fund and support developing countries through helping them tackle the impacts of climate change through adaptation and mitigation, but also help them to sustainably develop so their development and economic growth is not restricted by climate agreements. It is also important that these climate agreements and negotiations are equal and fair, and that the UNFCCC implements structures that ensure developing countries are heard and that there are no corrupt arrangements or deals. A global cap and trade system based on equity may also prevent developing countries from having their development limited, whilst also gradually reducing carbon emissions. Finally, to ensure developed countries are held accountable for their promises and these policies are fully implemented, there needs to be stricter enforcement of these policies and sanctions against developed countries that do not reduce their emissions, such as trade penalties. As Peter Singer argues, global governance allows for a global response, which is necessary when tackling this global climate change crisis.